This is how to develop a plan to get off your mom's couch, cracking the code to artistic independence. This video is aimed at people who want to build a career of artistic independence. It's a plan that I have used. Basically, the plan is based upon this simple formula: responsibility equals power, and power equals freedom. Every message that we receive in contemporary culture teaches us that late-stage capitalism is predatory, and that what we're to do is we're to opt out of responsibility, and that is how we gain our freedom. And the truth of the matter, the simple fact of the matter is it's quite the opposite. By taking on responsibility, we gain power. Through power, we are able to leverage a degree of artistic freedom. This requires planning ahead, and the central question in this entire plan revolves around your parents' money. Are your parents stacked? If your parents are stacked and they're willing to underwrite your endeavors, then we're on the yes side of the branch, and that means that you may in fact already have artistic freedom. Many of us are not so fortunate, and we find ourselves on the no side of the branch, which is that mom and dad are not going to pay for our endeavors. We're not independently wealthy. If that's the case, then as I see it, there are effectively two types of work in terms of creative process. There is work with a clear economic value, and there is work without a clear economic value, which I refer to as the Jessica Stockholder syndrome. Now, I'm not making a value judgment, quite the opposite. I love this work. I love Jessica's work. And I think that, but there are two different types of work. What I'm talking about here today is building a career, and it's important to distinguish between the two types. So as an example, work with a clear economic value involves creative tasks like sound design, audio engineering, UX UI design, carpentry, painting skills, things that if you wanted to work as a studio assistant for a contemporary artist, or if you wanted to work at a design firm, those types of activities are creative. They're related to art. They are in fact a form of art, and they have a clear economic value. Over here on this side of the equation, we see things that, unless they're inside of a blue chip gallery, have less clear economic value. You can see here I got a shitty version, and I know it's not, this isn't actually sculpture, but a shitty version, a shitty interpretation of Jessica Stockholder's work from Etsy here. And I want to underscore this point doubly, which is I am not making a value judgment between the two. Oftentimes, the individual is really interested in working on work that is far-flung. Here we see an example from my own work while I was working for Elektra Records. So I was working for Elektra Records right out of graduate school, and at the same time, I was working on this kind of performance-based work. This work has no clear economic model. So the first step in the process as I see it, is to understand at least the difference between these two different types of work. One, the work with a clear economic model can help put food on the table, over here on the left side of the branch, and can help you build a practice. The work that's over on the right-hand side of the work, the more experimental work, if you work on that exclusively, you're going to end up on your mom's couch. So the number one most important component in creating a plan for artistic freedom is desire, right? And what do I mean by that? I mean that, as an example, after I left graduate school and had spent a tremendous amount of both intellectual, emotional, and financial effort on developing a body of work and developing my practice, I would have figuratively rather cut off my own arm than to have had that go nowhere. So I was willing. You have to be willing to do what is necessary, the hard work at the beginning of the process, in order to build a self-sustaining economic model for the work. And that is all based upon the idea of skills pay bills. So the first task, regardless of whether you go to school, regardless of whether you go to college, regardless of whether you go to grad school, is to skill up, to develop graphic design skills, sound typography, UX UI design, page layout, animation, and sound design, or in carpentry, music, painting, but to develop what is referred to as a skills stack. That is the primary task, the primary issue at hand. The second thing, which has a kind of, outside of undergraduate schools, has a negative association, is to think very deeply about one's portfolio. Even if you want to work as a studio assistant, even if you begin to attempt to begin your practice as a studio assistant for a contemporary artist, the primary thing is to develop a portfolio. And in that process, you need to benchmark and research. So in the graphic design field, as an example, what we would look at is we might look at a set of the top, what I think is some of the best New York design firms, or 2x4 as an example, Pentagram, Chermayeff and Geismar and Haviv and Walsh and Area 17. So what do I mean by researching and benchmarking? If we look at this Pentagram example, I am literally referring to the idea that when you develop your work in the beginning, and we're talking about in the beginning stages of one's career, that what you would do is you would take a look at this, you would insert your own work in thumbnail form into a screen capture of the Pentagram site as an example, or you would put your work next to Jessica Walsh's work, and you would A to B them, and you would be honest with yourself about your own development. Does my work, does one's work at the beginning of one's career hold up to this type of work? And then if you're going to attempt to work for a studio like this, you have to gear your work to that type of environment. So again, I'm not referring to graphic design. This could be for audio engineering, it could be for sound design, it could be for contemporary art. But benchmarking and research, the next step in the process would be to expose one's process, one's thinking. I don't see this. This is something that I rarely see. Something that was incredibly advantageous to me was to produce a process book, which a portfolio tends to be finished examples of one's work with studio photography or crystal clear audio recordings. What I did and what I have my graduate students do is produce a process book. And that is the point behind that is to expose your thinking in the stages of the work in process. People that are going to hire you, whether they're contemporary artists, recording studios, agencies, or design studios, I believe that they want to see the finished product, but they want to understand your thinking. That is the most important process. So to focus on process. As we're getting deeper in this process, I think time allocation is really important. I'm going to show what I don't think makes sense. And again, we're talking about a timeline where we're building. So a lot of the things that I'm talking about, they only apply at the beginning stages of attempting to gain artistic freedom. So in the beginning of this process, it is important. I see many people spending 85% of their time working on, and again, this is the Etsy version of Jessica Stockholder's sculpture. They spend 85% of their time working on that, and they spend 15% of their time working on, this is my own work and is experimental in its own right, but they spend 85% of their time working on work that has no clear economic model underneath it and it makes no sense whatsoever. What am I saying? I'm saying that if you want to work for a design firm, you have to do your research and you have to actually make work that makes sense to the firm. If you want to work for a recording studio or do audio production, you're going to have to produce work that makes sense, that has a clear economic value that underpins it. Now, again, I am talking about eventually building off of that in a productive way that provides you with complete artistic freedom, which is what we're going to get into here, how it begins and how it develops. So there's a paper stack analogy that I like to use. And what is that? It's think about a stack of papers on your desk, and there is the work that you don't love, which in the beginning of one's career is quite large, and there is the work that you love, which is quite small. Now, the goal is to move the stacks from the work that you don't love being large to the work you love being little, to the work that you don't love being small over here, to the work that you do love being large. Now, this takes time and it takes playing a kind of four-dimensional chess. But I think one of the things that I see over and over is with people that are unable to develop artistic freedom, I see an inability to work through this process. And when I was working for design firms in New York, who will remain nameless, I was always shocked. I thought that, well, the studio would be filled absolutely 100% with work that was completely idealistic, was experimental in a way, or was the stuff that they loved doing. But every artist that I have ever met and every designer that I've ever met has done some very small percentage of work in an ideal sense that was simply to keep the lights on. Now, I know that is a disappointing thing to learn, but it's true. So the next step in the process is if in fact, you end up working for a design studio as an assistant for a contemporary artist, or at a recording studio or a TV studio doing audio production or something, that the goal would be to become invaluable, to become incredibly important, to be a good worker at that company, and then to transition from working 5 days a week if you're doing a good job. Now, if you're fucking it up, if you're a terrible worker, this will never work. You have to be really valuable to the studio in order to go from working 5 days a week to asking to work 3 days a week. Now, if they value you, they'll probably be up for this, and then to eventually transition to 1 day a week. It's a progression of independence built off of skills or design. So what I've seen over and over is I've seen highly effective and highly successful people that have a tremendous degree of artistic freedom doing this in a number of different capacities. They work for someone for 5 days a week. The people really value what they do. They say, listen, I've got my own practice popping. My own shit is popping because they're working on the weekends, and they're working here when they're working 5 days a week. They're working on the weekends and they're working at night trying to get their own practice off the ground. As that starts to pop, they transition to working 3 days a week. So they're working 2 full days on their own work, 3 days on another studio's work, and on the weekends they're working on their own stuff. Finally, to transitioning to 1 day a week where they're working the rest of the 6 days on their own work, and 1 day a week to keep stable financial components happening. And then the last component of this aspect of the plan, I'm going to show that when I left grad school, I went to work for Elektra Records. I ended up getting fired from them. I did not do this. This is just an icon that I found. But I was doing production and some design for Elektra Records before I got fired, and then when I got fired, I started working for None Such, which is part of the Atlantic family. That was a large stack of work. I cared about some of it, right? But at the same time, I was doing performance-based work. So I was doing exactly what we're referring to. I was doing this type of thing. I would work in the mornings. I would work in the mornings on production and design for None Such and some of the book publishers in New York, in this large stack of work that was paying the bills. And in the afternoons, I was doing this kind of performance-based piece. Over time, I worked hard to move this percentage, to make the small stack, to make the work that I was making and loving larger, and the work that was just for economics very, very small. Now, the major points in this process are that, first of all, the most important component is desire. You have to want artistic independence more than you enjoy riding the couch. It's that simple, and I don't see that very often. Often, I see that the hard work that's necessary at the beginning of one's career to get that thing to pop, people aren't willing to do. That's the first thing. So if you're not a hard worker and you're not highly motivated, it's not going to work. The second thing is that you have to skill up, without a doubt. You have to build the skill stack to become invaluable to a studio, to some commercial art studio, photography studio, recording studio, agency, graphic design studio that you're working for, in order for them in order for them to allow you to kind of transition seamlessly. In order to get that, you have to benchmark and research design firms, recording studios, and artist studios, and you have to make work that makes some kind of, a portion of your work that makes some kind of sense to them. Now, I would suggest that you pick design firms, studios, recording studios at the absolute top of the food chain, and then you have to think about your economic model. Look, food is not going to put itself, unless you've got rich parents, it's not going to put itself on the table. You're not going to be able to do this by sitting around. You're going to doom yourself to a life of a pauper. So don't spend 85% of your time making work that has, in the beginnings of your career, that has no relationship to design or no relationship to where you actually want to work, and then wonder why you can't get a job. In this process of the 5-3-2-1, moving from 5 days a week to 3 to 1, one of the biggest problems is, as you become successful, they'll throw money at you. And money is seductive. So in order to gain artistic independence, you have to have the self-discipline in that stacks method to transition out of that based upon the economic viability of your own work, to gain power and control over your own career. And then finally, looping back the formula, right? Everything in our culture teaches us the opposite of this. They teach us that that the way to be free is to automatically have no one count on us, have zero responsibilities, and to float free. Almost every piece of music, every piece of popular literature, film espouses this ethos, and it's completely wrong, which is that if you head headlong into assuming responsibility, that is where power comes from, and you can use power to leverage that into freedom. So what I'm referring to is I'm referring to growing into artistic freedom. Now, there's more than one way to skin the cat, I'm sure. I'm sure there have been people who from the jump have produced one piece of idealistic and ambitious work, and boom, they're off and running. That is also a possibility. I am providing a plan that I've seen step by step work over and over for numerous people. I hope this helps. Until next time.